Our reading for today comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 23, verse 26, and then verses 33 through 38. Let us hear the words of the Lord. As they led him away, they seized Simon from Cyrene, who was on his way in from the country, and put the cross on him and made him to carry it behind Jesus. When they came to the place called the Skull, there they crucified him along with the criminals, one on his right, the other on his left. And Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. The people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. They said, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Christ of God, the chosen one." Then the soldiers also came up and mocked him. They offered him wine vinegar and said, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was a written notice above him which read, "This is the King of the Jews." This is the word of God that is spoken for us, the people of God. Thanks be to God. And throughout this Lenten season, we're going to be reading a fictional monologue from a different character that appears in the Passion narratives. This one from Simon of Cyrene comes from Adam Hamilton's book, Final Words. We had spent 2 weeks sailing from the north coast of Africa to celebrate the Passover in Jerusalem. My sons were small boys, yet old enough to feel the excitement as we approached the holy city. As our small caravan came over the last hill, Rufus let out a shout. "Look, Father, the temple." There she stood, the earthly palace of God, gleaming as she towered over the city. Though my family had lived in Cyrene for generations, Jerusalem was for us, as for every Jew, our heart's home. That night we joined our cousins in Bethany for the Passover Seder that marked the beginning of the festival, sharing a meal and recalling God's salvation of our people. We ended that meal, as we did every year, praying for the coming of the Messiah. The next morning, Rufus, Alexander, and I left early to spend the day in Jerusalem, visiting the temple and then the festival taking place near the markets. As we approached the city, we saw what appeared to be a parade coming our way. But soon we could see that this was no parade. There were Roman soldiers driving 3 criminals toward the rock quarry where the criminals were crucified. Each of these criminals was carrying a heavy beam across his shoulders. One clearly had been badly beaten, for his body was bloodied, and he looked as though he could barely walk. I took Rufus and Alexander by the hand and pulled them away from the road. I did not want them to see this terrible thing. Just then, the tragic figure, the sorely wounded man, stumbled and fell at my feet. I saw that his brow was wrapped in a crude crown of thorns, and suddenly I realized who this man was. This was Jesus of Nazareth, whom some had claimed was the Messiah. He had been critical of the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem. I could not believe it. They had actually sentenced him to death. Everything happened so quickly, I was lost in my thoughts when I heard one of the soldiers say, "You there, carry his cross. And you, Jesus, get to your feet." There was nothing I could do. I told my boys, "Stay close." I picked up the beam, far heavier than I had imagined, and pitched it over my shoulder. Then I reached out a hand to Jesus to help him up. He was clearly in pain, but there was still in his face a strength and determination. He looked me in the eyes as if to thank me, and then he set his face toward Calvary. It was only a 5-minute walk to the place they called the Skull, Calvary, where the Romans crucified their victims. Dropping the beam before the executioners, I stepped back, searching for my boys, and then we stood and watched as they assembled the cross. They stretched his arms to the sides before they drove the spikes into his wrists and he shouted in pain. Then they nailed his ankles into the side of the cross, one on the right and one on the left. Finally, they hoisted his cross up and in position, and as they did, he let out another shout of pain. Because I had never been so close to a crucifixion, I had not realized what a horrible thing this was. Rufus began to cry. Alexander became nauseous. There were 2 thieves being crucified with Jesus, and the soldiers hoisted each one into the air. The Romans shouted to the crowd, "Take a look at your king now. This is a lesson from Rome. Don't forget it." The soldiers, laughing, began to throw dice for his clothing. Some in the crowd wept. Others hurled insults at him. The religious leaders stood with their arms crossed, a strange expression of satisfaction upon their faces. And then Jesus took a deep breath, and someone in the crowd said, "Shh, he's about to say something." This is what he said: "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Amen. Well, it was April of 2002. It was my senior year in college at the time, and my mentor, Jeff Landed, had just passed away very unexpectedly at the young age of 30. I did what most people do in times like that. I mean, his death was a shock. It was something that was a surprise to every one of us. So I went to the funeral. I grieved. I cried. I wept. I tried to support his widow the best that I could. And I remember a few months after that, I was wrestling with my sense of call. And some of his last words came back to me. And I remembered that one of the last things he said to me is, "You're going to make a good teacher someday." And I clung to those words. They came to define me. And so over the next several years, they started to reshape the way that I saw myself. They began to reshape the way that I saw my call. I began to pursue PhD work to be a teacher at a college, all because he had spoken those words to me in his last few breaths. Still today, I view myself primarily as a teaching pastor because of the words that he spoke to me. You know, when somebody is on their deathbed, when they're just about to die, people often want their lives to count for something, right? They want to make sure that their lives really, really mattered, and they want to leave a lasting legacy behind, and so they often measure the words that they are speaking very carefully, right? Right? We tend to lean in. I mean, some people want their family or their friends to know how much they care. Some people just kind of pass on their last final words of advice. Right? Other people, they try to resolve grudges. They try to get right with God. Maybe they go out and they try to check off the last few things on their bucket list to make sure they get done before they die. I remember before my Aunt Peggy passed away, she had asked for this cross that one of her kids had made for her. And she held it up to every single person that was in the room as the sign of assurance of the hope of the resurrection that was still to come for her. I mean, when someone is on their deathbed, we listen to their final words more carefully, more closely than we do at any other time, because we know that they're choosing those words carefully. We know that the words they're speaking are spoken with intention, that they are words that they want us to cling to, that they may be the last words that they say to us. And in the case of crucifixion, I mean, the very act of speaking was incredibly painful, and it required a lot of energy and a lot of exertion. I mean, death by crucifixion wasn't because you got nails, hammered through your wrists or your hands, right? Death by crucifixion came over a long period of time as you eventually weren't able to breathe anymore, because the only way you could breathe on a cross was to lift yourself up to breathe. That was the only way you could speak. And so every time that Jesus speaks from the cross, he's intentionally pushing himself up, rotating his wrists on those nails, scraping his back against the beam of the cross in order to speak these words. Right? Words from crosses were exceptionally rare because it was just too painful and it required far too much energy to get anything else out. Yet here, as we see Jesus hanging on the cross, we hear him speak 7 final statements. Right? 7 final words, which are really the pulse and the heartbeat of the crucifixion narrative, because these words declare what Jesus is doing there. These words declare who he is and what really matters and what's on his heart and mind in the last moments of his life. I mean, these are the words that we need to lean into. Right? Listen to a little bit more carefully, that we might ultimately be shaped by them. And so throughout this Lenten season, we're going to be exploring these 7 final words and what each and every one of them have to say to us still today. We're going to explore them in our sermons, but I also want to encourage you to take time to engage in the prayer stations that are going to be up and around the rooms. Like the first one's right over here today, and every week there's going to be a reflection that is there, that is based on this passage, that we might lean in a little more even and reflect on our lives as we hear Jesus speaking these words. We're beginning today with what's traditionally understood to be the very first thing that Jesus spoke from the cross. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. And the fact that it's the very first thing he says gives it a little more emphasis, because he wanted to make sure that this one got out. Right, this word defines what the cross really means. It defines that the cross is really a cross of forgiveness. It's a cross of forgiveness. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. So I want to set the scene for you a little bit, because in the last few hours, Jesus has been through a lot. In the last few hours, he's been betrayed. He's been arrested. He's been put on trial. He's been falsely accused. He's sheltered the cries of an angry mob. He's felt the lash of a whip against his back again and again and again. And that his skin had been ripped to shreds by the pieces of glass and stone and metal and bone that were in the whip. Right? He's lost massive amounts of blood by now. He's carried a 300-pound crossbeam through the streets. He's been hit by a club. He's been nailed to a cross, all the while being mocked by the soldiers and the religious leaders and the crowd and everyone that's at the foot of the cross. And yet he still finds it in him to cry out, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. In fact, the Greek tense of that verb, forgive, implies that this is not something that Jesus says just once. It's something that he says over and over and over again. This is his mantra as he is hanging there on the cross. One sermon put it this way. It said, when the nails tore through his tendons, sending jolts of pain rushing through his body, he closed his eyes and he prayed, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. When the cross dropped into place between the two criminals, he cried out, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. When they divided up his earthly possessions below the cross, he exclaimed, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. As the rulers sneered at him, he replied, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. As the soldiers mocked him, he shouted out, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. When the sign, this is the King of the Jews, was hammered above his head. Again, he sighed, "Father, forgive them. They know not what they do." Again and again and again, at every single turn, he cries out with these words, "Father, forgive them. They know not what they do." You know, these are words that we're supposed to dwell on. These are words we're supposed to reflect on and meditate on and lean into and listen to. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. I mean, they're really unusual words. Especially words from a cross, because it's not the kinds of words that we expect to hear after everything that Jesus has been through, right? It's not the kinds of words that we would say if we'd been through all that, right? But what we expect in moments like this are words of anger, right? Words of frustration, words of vengeance maybe, words of revenge, words that maybe echo the words of back in Elijah. I don't know if you remember the story. Centuries before, the people come out and Elijah's upset and he says, "God, send down fire from heaven and destroy them." Right? Those are the kinds of words that we expect from a cross. But instead, the words that we get from Jesus are, "Father, forgive them. Forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." I mean, he forgives the soldiers who whipped him and beat him to a pulp. He forgives the Jewish leaders who put him there. He forgives the crowd who taunts him and mocks him. He forgives the criminals who are hanging there on the crosses beside them. And most importantly, he forgives us. Because it's our sin that put him there. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. Adam Hamilton puts it like this in his book, Final Words, which is the inspiration for this series. He says, Jesus' prayer gives voice to what Jesus is doing on the cross at that moment in time. He's offering himself to God and his Father as an offering for our sin. The sacrificial act was for those who had come before him and for those who would come after him just as much as it was for those who heard his words that day. This is the power of the words that Jesus cried from the cross. They were prayed not only for those who stood by the cross that day, they were prayed for us as well. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. And I want to suggest that one statement teaches us at least three things today. Three things. And the first is that these words declare our desperate need for God's forgiveness. Our desperate need for his forgiveness, because the truth is this cross is our cross. Right? This death is our death. This forgiveness that Jesus is proclaiming is our forgiveness. He is dying for you and he is dying for me, that we might be forgiven of all of our sin. And the truth is, we can't live without it. We can't live without it. We need it because all of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We need it because every one of us has rebelled against him. We need it because every one of us has broken his commands and gone our own way and done our own thing. I remember this moment when I was back in junior high. You know, one day I was after cross-country practice, and I walked into the lobby of the school, and there was this can of pop there with some change sitting next to it. And I knew it wasn't mine, but there was no one else around. And so I took the change, and I went and bought myself something in the vending machine, and I remember after that I felt incredibly guilty about this for days on end. And I never did anything like that again, but I've done countless other things over my life. Right? Things that I'm not proud of, things that were not of God. You see, as adults, we don't stop sinning. We don't stop rebelling. Our sins just get a little more sophisticated. Right? We become better at hiding it, justifying it to ourselves, even dismissing it, maybe even explaining them away. You see, Jesus says, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do, because the truth is we don't know what we do. we don't know the kind of impact that our sin really has on this world. We desperately need his forgiveness for all the places we've been and all the things that we've done because we are deserving of the wrath of God. Adam Hamilton puts it this way: sin is the problem that we never outgrow. Right? Romans says that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. I mean, the fact is, God is a good God. He's a good God. He's a just God. He's a loving God. And the thing about a good and just God is that he cannot leave sin unpunished. I mean, just think of it like this. Think of it like a court case, right? Imagine that your child was brutally murdered. And the person that did it was caught. And they were taken to the courtroom and they say, Judge, I admit that I did this, but I've also done a lot of other good things in my life. I've helped the poor, I've given to charity, I've done this, I've done that. And they start to list off this long laundry list of all the good that they have accomplished and done. If at the end of the day the judge said, you've done a lot of good, I think I'm just going to let you go. We'd probably conclude that wasn't a very good judge, right? See, and our God is the same way. The sin simply cannot be dismissed. It has to be dealt with. It has to be dealt with. The penalty for our sins need to be paid. And that's why Jesus came into this world. To pay the penalty that we deserved. To die the death that we deserved. To take our place. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. See, Jesus speaks these words to declare our desperate need for forgiveness, because it's only when we truly understand how much we need it that we're in a position to be able to respond to his grace and his mercy. Secondly, these words declare that God's forgiveness is for us. It's for us. But the term forgive actually comes from the realm of commerce. Literally, it means to cancel a debt or to pardon a loan so that you never have to pay it back again. See, in spite of everything that we've done, Jesus forgives our debt. He cancels our loan. He pardons our sin. Even though we are worthy of judgment and death, he pardons it. He takes our place. Even though we are deserving of death, he still chooses to freely show his forgiveness to us. His grace to us. And the remarkable thing about this whole story to me is that he does it even when they are still sinning against him in that moment. I mean, he speaks these words as they're mocking him. I mean, he speaks these words as they're hurling insults at him. He speaks these words as they're spitting on him. He speaks these words as they're casting lots for his clothes. He does it as they are sinning against him. And that's true for us as well. Romans puts it like this: while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. Indeed, rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person, someone might actually dare to die. But God proves his love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. While we were still sinners, while we were still spitting in his face, while we were still going our own way, while we were still running after our stuff, at that moment, Jesus, knowing all of that is going to take place, looks out and says, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. See, he still chooses to take our place, even though he knew what we would do. Even though he knows what's still hiding in your closet right now. He still chooses to speak these words. And maybe there are some of you who or too embarrassed or too ashamed to even admit what you've done. Maybe some of you think that what you've done is so bad and so wrong that it can't possibly be forgiven. But I want to tell you that the cross says something different. If Jesus can forgive the people who put nails in his skin, then he can certainly forgive you as well. If he can forgive the people who sentenced him to death, then he can certainly forgive you as well, no matter where you've been or what you've done. And the real question is, will you receive his offer of forgiveness? Will you receive it? Will you admit your need? Will you throw yourself on his grace? Will you hear these words, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. And then finally, these words are a call for us to extend that same forgiveness to other people. You see, this forgiveness that Jesus is speaking, that he's offering here, isn't simply a gift for us. It's also a model for us to follow. And the way that we treat the people in our lives. I mean, I find it remarkable that Jesus could have simply prayed this prayer quietly to himself. But instead, he speaks it so that we can hear it and we can see it. Or he speaks it because he wants us to embody the same kind of forgiveness in our lives. Someone once said, forgiveness is the virtue that we profess to believe in, but we fail to really practice. Elizabeth O'Connor said, despite 100 sermons on forgiveness, we still don't forgive easily. Right? We want forgiveness for ourselves and justice for everybody else. I'm reminded of a story. It's a story about a man. He was bitten by a dog. He got rabies. It was at a time when they still didn't have a cure for rabies. And so he was in there at the hospital. They were trying to figure out what to do. The doctor said, there's nothing we can do for you. You better get your final affairs in order. And so he asked for a pad of paper and a pen, and he just started to write and write and write. And about an hour later, the doctor came back by, and he was still there writing and writing. And the doctor popped his head in and said, man, I'm so glad that you've decided to get your will together. He looked up and said, will? This isn't a will. This is the list of people I'm going to bite. See, forgiveness isn't something that comes easily. It's not something we like to do because when we've been hurt and when someone's done something to us, our natural reaction is to get angry, is to get frustrated, is to take revenge, it's to get even. But Jesus shows us that we're called to forgive. We're called to let it go. There's this connection between receiving forgiveness and extending forgiveness, right? We pray it every week in the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Because it's difficult to receive forgiveness when we can't extend it to others as well. Jesus put it like this. He told this parable in Matthew chapter 18. It's a story about it. He says that there was this king, and he went away on a journey and eventually came back, and he wanted to settle his accounts, and the king's supposed to represent God in the story. And so he calls in the first man, and this man owes him millions and millions and millions of dollars. The implication is he owes him so much he could never possibly repay it in the course of his entire life, no matter how much he worked and no matter how much he tried. And so he comes to him and he says, please, give me time, I'll repay it. And so the king's moved by this plea, and he forgives his debt, cancels his loan, and tells him to go. And he goes out and he runs into this fellow guy who owed him a few pennies, something that wasn't much at all. It could be easily paid back. And he falls down on his knees and he begging to this guy the same exact words that he'd just used when he was in there before the king. And he refuses to forgive him. And some of the other servants get wind of this. And they go and they tell the king. And the king calls him back in. And he said, I forgave this whole debt. Shouldn't you have forgiven your fellow servant just as I had forgiven you? You see, we're called to forgive, not because the other person deserves it. Right? We didn't deserve to have our sin forgiven. We're called to forgive simply because we've been forgiven. Right? Simply because Jesus has chosen to forgive us. And so I want you to take a moment and think about who you might need to forgive. And I want you to hear these words one more time. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. In just a few moments, we're going to sing a song. And I want to invite you forward to respond to God in this time. There's some dissolvable tablets here at the front and a couple pitchers of water. And as you're led, I just want to invite you to come forward and pick up one of the tablets. Maybe confess your sins and drop them on. And as you watch it dissolve, remember how you're forgiven. Maybe there's somebody that you need to forgive. And maybe speak that name as you drop it in and let it go. However God calls you to respond, that you might hear these words, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. So if our band would come, let us pray. Jesus, we come to you. We come as broken people, sinful people in need of your forgiveness again. And so we offer ourselves to you. And we ask, Jesus, that you would cleanse us of all of our sin. We ask that you would bring to mind the names of those people that we need to forgive. That we might truly live as you lived. And our forgiveness might become our first and our last impulse. In your holy name we pray. Amen.